I thought I was healing. I thought the worst had passed. I thought I had learned the lesson, closed the door, and finally let myself breathe. I even started to believe the version of me that smiled without trying too hard. That's the version I let onto camera, the version I let into rooms, the version I wrote into my diary at midnight. I told myself the story of recovery so many times it sounded like truth. But then something small, so small I almost missed it, appeared. It didn't come as a thunderclap, it didn't shatter glass or send the sky falling. It came like an old song on a crowded train, like a scent that carried me back to a street I hadn't walked in years. It came as a phrase someone said, the tilt of a head, a familiarity in a laugh. And before I fully registered that I was slipping, I was somewhere I swore I would never go again. You know that moment when you realize a scar isn't as closed as you thought? When the scab lifts and the skin underneath is raw, and you remember how it hurt the first time? That's what happened to me. One subtle echo brought a flood of memories, and with them, a collapse I had not anticipated. Healing is not a straight line. I used to say that as if it were a motto, as if repetition made it less scary. I read the books, I did the meditations, I nodded at therapists and wrote out the affirmations, and still I expected the graph of my life to slope slowly upward and stay there. I did not expect the sudden drop. I did not expect to be blindsided by a feeling I assumed belonged to a locked room in my past. I tell you this because so many of us have the same secret. We declare ourselves healed long before the wound agrees. We post the photos, we throw the parties, we buy the plants, and we put on the jacket of fixed. And that jacket is comfortable, so comfortable that we forget the seams are fragile. When it broke me again, what I felt first was embarrassment. Not the kind of embarrassment that fades with a shrug. This was the embarrassment of being human in front of my own story. I had rehearsed my new self for months, maybe years. I had invested in that image. To have it cracked wide felt like being caught lying to myself. Then came the shame. I tried to hide the fact that I backtracked. I tried to explain it away with logic and rationalizations. It was just a memory. It was just stress. It has nothing to do with who I am now. But shame has its own gravity. It pulled me towards silence. I became an expert at small talk and a stranger to my own heart. And under the shame, quietly and persistently, came fear. Not of the thing that had hurt me, I knew the facts of that story, but fear that this relapse meant I was failing at becoming someone else. What if healing was an illusion, a performance I couldn't sustain? What if everything I had built would crumble at the first gust? I want you to imagine that moment with me, because if you are watching this, you might already know it. You might recognize the trembling hands at the sink, the sleepless nights, the sudden avalanche of tears while doing something ordinary. You might be living the uncomfortable surprise of learning that a healed person is actually still a person, and people fall apart sometimes. So, what did I do when it broke me? I did 3 hard things, and I want to walk through them because they saved me from becoming permanently broken. First, I stopped pretending. Pretending is one of the stealthiest killers of progress. It convinces you that if you smile long enough, the pain will stop asking questions. But pretending buries the real signal under layers of performance. I sat with the exact feelings I was ashamed to have. I named them out loud: embarrassment, shame, fear, loneliness. Saying the words took oxygen out of the panic. It made the avalanche into pieces I could hold. Second, I borrowed language from someone wiser than my panic. I let myself be a person who was allowed to have setbacks. Not because setbacks mean I failed, but because setbacks mean I tried. Healing that never sees turbulence is probably not real healing, it's avoidance. Real healing goes through messy, sticky places and still finds a way back. I read, I listened to people who had been through similar ruptures, and I let their stories expand what I believed was possible for me. Third, I set a radical boundary, one that looked small but felt enormous. I stopped exposing my tender places for cheap validation. I cut off the habit of telling my entire story to anyone who asked, or worse, anyone who scrolled. Vulnerability had become performative. I replaced it with selective honesty. The difference felt like switching from a lamp that blasts light into every corner to a candle that warms only the hands I choose to hold. These three things didn't fix me overnight. They didn't plaster over every crack. But they turned the collapse into a doorway rather than a pit. There's a myth I want to dismantle right now. That healing is private and polished. That you only show the glow-up and never the nights you lay with your knees to your chest. The truth is messier and more human. The truth is that showing the night can make the day more believable. The truth is that the act of telling when you're broken, honestly, without spectacle, connects you to someone else who is, in that exact hour, holding their breath. After the relapse, I learned to ask better questions. Instead of, why did this happen to me? I began asking, what is this trying to teach me? And how can this change the way I repair? That reframing mattered more than any motivational quote. It turned victim energy into curiosity. Curiosity is quietly fierce. It doesn't deny pain, it leans into it with eyes open. One concrete habit I built was a 5-minute check-in every evening. That's all. 5 minutes to scribble the day's emotional weather. What unsettled me? What surprised me? What small mercy did I receive? It sounds tiny because it is, and because of that smallness, it became doable on days when everything else felt impossible. Those 5 minutes acted like stitches, not glamorous, but they kept my edges from fraying. Another thing I did was to forgive myself for being inconsistent. The human brain loves patterns. It wants to tidy up the story into a neat arc. But life doesn't always give arcs. Sometimes it gives loops and spirals and detours. Forgiving inconsistency is different from accepting defeat. It's a recognition that the path to wholeness is experienced in increments. This small shift took the weight off my shoulders. I also learned to be choosy about the mirrors I stood in front of. Social media is a mirror, but it's a warped one. It reflects the brightest filter and hides the corners. I made a list of 3 people I could call at 2 a.m. and 3 people I could text a random, unpolished thought to without fear of judgment. Those contacts became a safety net. Real people, not strangers with likes, became the measure of my reality. Here's a truth I discovered. Breaking open again does not erase the real healing you've done. It is not a sign that you wasted your time. It simply means there is more to learn. If your healing were a house, this would be the inspection that reveals a weak beam. It's painful, but now you can repair it consciously rather than ignoring the rot until everything collapses. There were moments when I considered running away from the discomfort altogether. I thought about moving cities, changing routines, inventing a new life with a new name. Running felt like an attractive option because it promised clean slates. But clean slates are illusions. You take your maps with you, your habits, your fears, your internal narratives. The better choice was to stay and rebuild with new plans and better materials. I want to tell you about a specific conversation that changed the trajectory for me. I called someone I hadn't called in months. I told them I'd relapsed. I said the word relapse out loud and watched it lose some of its power. The person on the other end didn't gasp or offer platitudes. They listened. They shared something equally vulnerable. The exchange wasn't transformative in a Hollywood moment of catharsis. It was quiet, ordinary, and enough. That was my turning point. The realization that connection, not solitude, was my real medicine. You might wonder, what if I don't have someone I can call? That's a fair and scary question. If you don't have that person yet, you can create one small ritual that functions like a trusted voice. Write a letter to yourself that acknowledges the relapse without judgment. Keep it somewhere safe. Reread it the next day. Pretend you are your own wise friend. Speak to yourself with the curiosity you would offer someone you love. Your inner language matters more than you think.
Now, I need to be blunt about something important. Not every relapse is the same. If what broke you involves ongoing harm, abuse, or danger, the step is not introspection alone. Seek safety first. Get help. If the thing that broke you feeds on isolation, call local resources, helplines, or professionals who can intervene. Courage sometimes looks like asking for help. It is not a lesser form of bravery. After the relapse, I did one more transformational thing. I rewired my narrative around progress. Instead of telling a linear story, broken, healed, perfect, I started telling a radial story. I described healing as a set of concentric circles, each one broader and more inclusive. Some circles are fragile, others hold strong. When a ripple hits, I remind myself that the center remains. The center is not a destination, it's a commitment to show up again. Expect setbacks. Expect small collapses. Plan for them. I keep a box of simple tasks that feel possible when I'm low. Wash the sheets, make a cup of tea, step outside for 3 minutes. The tasks are tiny by design, because when you are broken again, giant goals become impossible. Tiny goals are repair in manageable doses. If you are watching this and thinking, I don't want to be a person who keeps breaking, hear this. Resilience is not an absence of breaking. Resilience is the skill of rebuilding with intention. You will become more skilled at it the more you practice, not because you wanted more pain, but because you learned how to navigate it. Here is something I wish someone had told me. The people who never speak about their relapses are not stronger. They are simply quieter. Your voice about the relapse is not a sign of failure. It is an offering. When you say, I fell back, you allow someone else to say, me too, and that creates a bridge. Bridges change trajectories. What I do now when I sense the familiar pull is this. I pause and map it quickly. 5 questions, aloud, no judgment. What triggered me? What did I feel first? What did I do next? Who can I tell right now? What tiny action will keep me from spiraling? The questions are mechanical, but the magic is in the ritual. Rituals translate emotion into action. I want to share one last truth before I close. The broken parts of you are not liabilities to hide. They are cartography. They show the places where your life has been tested and where you are invited to grow stronger. When you orient toward that map with tenderness and curiosity, you give yourself direction rather than condemnation. If you are worried about being defined by your relapses, stop. The most courageous thing you can do is to let your story be permeable. Let new experiences enter. Let new friendships into your inner circle. Let your narrative expand to include not just how you fell, but how you rose and how you rose differently. I will not romanticize pain. I will not tell you it's beautiful to be broken. It isn't always. Pain is blunt and heavy and sometimes unjust. But if you allow it to be a teacher without being your identity, you will discover a version of yourself that knows how to carry tenderness and strength at the same time. So if you're sitting there thinking, I thought I was done with this, know you're not alone. That line, I thought I was healing, is one of the most honest confessions you can make. It recognizes progress and vulnerability at the same time. Keep saying it when it's true. Keep naming what breaks you and what mends you. Keep building those tiny rituals that become anchors.
I kept going because the alternative felt impossible. I learned to make tiny agreements with myself when the world seemed intent on proving that I was still fragile. Agreements like, I will not check messages for 1 hour. I will not make any big decisions today. I will put my phone in another room and breathe for 3 minutes. These were not heroic acts. They were small contracts that said, you are allowed to be here without performing for the world. There were rituals I adopted that had nothing to do with healing manuals and everything to do with anchoring me in the present. I learned to cradle a mug with both hands until my fingers stopped trembling. I learned to water one plant every morning and watch new leaves unfurl as a daily reminder that life continues in small increments. I learned to make my bed, not because it fixed anything, but because the act of making something orderly around me quieted the chaos inside me for a minute. When the past showed up uninvited, I started treating it like an unexpected guest rather than a house robber. I greeted it. I offered it water. I listened to what it wanted to say without letting it sleep on my couch forever. Sometimes that guest left quickly. Sometimes they stayed for dinner and demanded to be heard until midnight. But giving them space to speak reduced their power to ambush me later. I built a vocabulary for my inner weather. Instead of saying, I feel bad, I learned to catalog feelings with more specificity. Hollow, prickly, weighted, buzzing, numb. Naming made the sensations less amorphous and less threatening. It allowed me to ask targeted questions. When I feel hollow, what am I starving for? When I feel prickly, who pushed against my boundaries? The vocabulary turned panic into data I could interrogate. I started keeping 2 notebooks. One was for witness, raw, messy, late-night entries where I let anger, grief, and confusion have full sentences. The other was for repair, practical lists, tiny habits, names of people to call, steps to take when overwhelm arrived. The split stopped me from doing what I'd done before, using introspection as an endless loop of rumination. Introspection through the witness notebook became purification. The repair notebook became an instruction manual. I experimented with gentleness as a discipline. For years, I had thought gentleness was soft and therefore optional. I was wrong. Gentleness required courage because it meant refusing the louder, angrier instinct to punish myself for failing to be steadily healed. Instead of criticism, I offered curiosity. Instead of a to-do list on bad days, I offered permission to rest. Over time, that permission started to feel less like a surrender and more like a foundation. There were physical practices that helped because mind and body are not separate houses, but rooms in the same building. I found that cold water on my face could halt spirals long enough to make a different choice. I learned to walk at a pace that matched my breath rather than my thoughts. I made a habit of holding my wrist and feeling my pulse when panic rose, an odd, intimate way to remind myself that the heart is still beating steadily, even during pain. I also began to curate language in the way I had once curated playlists. Certain phrases made me smaller. You should be over this by now. Others have it worse. Other phrases gave me room. This is happening now, and it is real. You are allowed to feel all of it. I repeated the sentences that widened my chest and swallowed the ones that tightened my throat. I rewired where I invested hope. Hope used to be a distant skyscraper I aimed for, not built. I started planting tiny, immediate seeds instead. Hope became a list of 3 domestic things I could accomplish in a day: fold laundry, call a friend, apply for 1 job, or send 1 message. Each checkmark didn't feel grand, but it accumulated into an architecture I could lean on when the wind came.
I studied relapse as a teacher with a whiteboard. I mapped triggers, specific smells, phrases, images, or settings that had a history of pulling me back. Next to each trigger, I wrote a response plan. The plan didn't require heroism. It required preparedness. For a smell, my plan might be to change my clothes and step outside. For a phrase, my plan might be to name it out loud and say, "Not now." For a setting, it might be to limit exposure or bring a friend. I learned that boundaries are not about building walls, but about setting doorways. I practiced saying no in small increments until it became less shocking to others and less guilt-inducing to me. Saying no preserved my energy for the people and projects that actually mattered. It also taught me that the world didn't collapse when I prioritized myself. People adjusted, some left, some stayed. That sorting was its own form of mercy.
I practiced returning to pleasure as a political act of self-preservation. For a long time, I viewed pleasure with suspicion, as if enjoying something was a denial of seriousness. But pleasure, quiet afternoons with a book, the sweetness of fruit, the exact smell of fresh sheets, became signals that I was building a life worth living even when pain arrived. Pleasure didn't erase pain. It created contrast and proof that I could hold multiple truths at once. I paid attention to the company I kept. There were people who, despite their care, made me feel volatile, mirrors that amplified the worst parts of my story. I didn't dramatize this. I made choices. I moved toward people who had steadiness in them, people whose presence felt like a room with good light. I sought out those who could witness my relapse without needing to fix it. Their steady, unflappable attention taught me patience with my own process. I built a habit of immediate small acts of kindness toward myself when I noticed a slip. If a memory knocked me sideways, I would immediately send myself one line, "You are allowed this day." Or I would order a simple comfort, fruit, a small plant, a candle. The purchase was not consumerist, it was symbolic. It was a tangible reminder that I could invest in my own survival. I learned to externalize the internal critic. I gave it a silly name, absurdly comic, and whenever it started its litany of accusations, I imagined passing a note to that character and saying, "Thank you, but not today." That act of personifying the critic made it less absolute and gave me a choice about whether to obey it. I encountered cycles where the relapse turned into an identity for others. People who had witnessed my first breakdown began to anticipate it, and in doing so, inadvertently became caretakers of the old story. That was a challenge, because I wanted people to recognize my change. I started sharing small, consistent updates, not as triumphalism, but as evidence that my life was moving. I learned to build continuity of identity by showing up with small, repeated behaviors rather than grand proclamations. There were days when the old wound announced itself with physical symptoms, tight chest, stomach drop, headache, and medical checkups became part of the healing plan. I stopped dismissing physical pain as merely psychological. I took tests, saw specialists, and treated the body with the seriousness it deserved. Sometimes medical reassurance reduced anxiety more than anything else. I kept an emergency kit. It fit in a small box, a list of numbers, a few comforting phrases written on index cards, lavender for scent, a small cash reserve, and a tiny photograph that reminded me of a time I had survived something equally brutal. The kit was both practical and talismanic. When my world felt too big, the kit felt like a hand reaching in and pulling me back to the present. I relearned how to apologize, not as capitulation, but as alignment. When my relapse hurt someone else, I practiced saying, "I'm sorry I hurt you. I am working on this." The apology named responsibility without making me smaller. It also allowed repair to happen between me and others, which was often more impactful than internal healing alone. I practiced listening in a radically non-performative way. When someone else confessed their relapse, I didn't rush to offer solutions. I let silence exist. I offered presence. I learned that being a steady witness to another person's fall was one of the strongest aids to recovery. It tethered me to humanity in a way that therapy sometimes could not. I took up small, creative practices that required no outcome. I drew messy lines on paper. I started a playlist for days I felt small, and another for days I felt restless. The point wasn't to produce art. It was to let my hands move and to remind myself that creation and repair are siblings. I practiced the brutal kindness of stopping a behavior that felt like healing, but wasn't. I remember a period where I thought constant journaling was saving me. Instead, it became rehashing. I replaced it for a while with 5 minutes of breathing and one deliberate act: calling someone, washing a cup, stepping outside. The substitution taught me that movement, tiny, deliberate, was often more healing than thought alone. I set limits with the past. I allowed myself to revisit memories, but within a container. A single hour once a week to explore the rough edges, accompanied by a cup of tea and a breathing practice. The container turned memory from a hijacker into a student. I learned to celebrate micro-resilience. When I resisted a panic attack by taking one tiny action, putting on shoes, stepping outside, I celebrated it as a victory. These micro-wins accumulated. They became the scaffolding that made recovery less random and more intentional. I created a map of safe places, not just physical locations, though those mattered: coffee shops with soft chairs, a park bench under a particular tree, but also actions and rituals that reliably calmed me: humming, folding paper, reading an old letter. When life felt treacherous, I navigated to these safe places and gave myself permission to stay there until I felt steadier. I began to practice radical patience with timelines. Before, intention felt like an enemy to be defeated. Now I saw it as a landscape to be traveled with maps and supplies. The recognition that I would never fully erase the possibility of pain freed me to plan effectively rather than panic. I experimented with slowing decisions down. When relapse made me want to flee, quit a job, end a relationship, I instituted a rule: wait 72 hours and do the smallest test possible. The pause often prevented catastrophes. Sometimes, after waiting, the urgent need had dissolved into a more manageable insight. I learned to allow grief to be messy and public in measured ways. I wrote letters I did not send. I sat on my balcony and let the city noise be a companion. I called out for help and accepted it when it came. I discovered that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but a choreographed act of survival. I began to pay attention to what I consumed: news, conversations, images, and how they affected my nervous system. I reduced exposure to things that amplified my fear. I replaced doom scrolling with reading single, thoughtful essays that left me reflective rather than raw. When I felt the old wound flare, I sometimes practiced radical generosity toward someone else. It could be as simple as sending an encouraging text or offering to do a small errand. The act of helping reoriented me from inward spirals to outward connection and reminded me I was part of a larger web of care. I learned to celebrate the ordinary minutes, the ones that don't make for dramatic videos or stirring captions. The mundane became sacred: making tea, folding laundry, putting on a sweater that smelled like home. Those ordinary acts were stitches that held me together between the big moments. I kept a list of emergency phrases that calmed me. This will pass like weather. I am greater than this moment. I have survived worse,
and learned. Saying them felt ridiculous at first, but repetition rewired my inner monologue so that it became kinder over time. I practiced being explicit with loved ones about my needs during a relapse. I stopped hinting and started stating clearly, "I need space tonight," or "I need you to sit with me for 20 minutes." Clarity cut through the fog better than any performance of composure. I wrote a short, honest paragraph to myself that I kept on the fridge. You are allowed to break and allowed to repair. Both are part of you. Reading it in the morning felt like checking in with an older, wiser friend who had lived the same cycles and had bread to share. I recognized that healing often asked for a slower kind of courage, the perseverance to do small, compassionate acts every day, even when they felt pointless. This slow courage had no fanfare, but it built endurance.
I cultivated a sense of astonishment at how many people carried hidden relapses beneath their polished surfaces. Knowing I was not unique in my falls decreased the shame and increased my compassion for others. I tuned into the slow work of rewiring habits. Old neural paths favored reactivity. New paths required repetition, deliberate attention, and time. I practiced and practiced until the new patterns felt less foreign. I allowed myself to be imperfect in front of people I loved. I practiced saying, "I am not okay right now," and watched how honest admission invited real care rather than performative fixes. I experimented with breathing patterns, longer exhales, counts, simple breaths, and learned how they changed my physiology and mood within minutes. Breathing became my first response rather than last resort. I reframed relapse as a sign of depth rather than defect. Depth meant I had been through things worth processing. It meant there was material to be transmuted rather than erased. I trained myself to notice the difference between productive dwelling and destructive rumination. Productive dwelling led to action. Rumination looped. Recognizing the difference allowed me to choose forward motion. I learned to ask for help without scripting an apology first. Help is not a favor, it is a tool. Using it didn't mean I was weak, it meant I was strategic. I kept practicing the art of returning to ordinary days. A normal day, groceries, a walk, a phone call, became a triumph after nights of collapse. Normalcy was a kind of medicine. I practiced radical honesty about my limits with important people. I asked for what I needed and accepted when they couldn't provide it. Acceptance freed me from dependency and encouraged me to diversify sources of support. I learned to frame my story not as a series of failures, but as a series of attempts. Each attempt taught me terms I could use for the next experiment in repair. I began to choose a life that was resilient not because it was unbreakable, but because it had better tools for repair. Better friends, better sleep, better rituals, better boundaries. I learned to scale back expectations elegantly. When relapse hit, I reduced the horizon of what I expected from myself. Scale back wasn't resignation, it was stewardship. I practiced the fierce tenderness of staying with pain for shorter increments. Feel, act, rest, return. The cycle repeated, but felt more manageable. I built a portfolio of antidotes: movement, art, conversation, nature, rest. Each antidote had conditions where it worked best. Learning which antidote to reach for was crucial. I started to appreciate the slow accrual of trust in myself. Trust is built by keeping small promises again and again. Those promises accumulated until the feeling of reliability could be leaned on. I learned to notice the small permissions I needed and give them to myself. Permission to cry, permission to leave, permission to rest, permission to continue. I practiced naming the subtle victories no one else would notice: a moment of calm in a storm, a breath taken before speaking, a text sent to ask for help. These invisible wins were not small. They were foundational. I kept building and rebuilding my life with the consciousness that it would not be perfectly fixed, only increasingly repairable, increasingly livable, increasingly generous. If this spoke to you, share this moment with someone who needs to know they are not alone. Like the video to help others find this conversation. Subscribe for more honest, raw conversations about repair and resilience. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next honest chapter. Leave a comment with the small thing that pulled you back and one tiny step you'll take today. Follow for more. Let's keep tending these lives together.
I trained myself to notice the difference between nostalgia and longing. Nostalgia can be a warm blanket that comforts. Longing can be an ache that pulls you backward into places that are not safe. Distinguishing them helped me decide when to reminisce and when to redirect. I experimented with micro-rituals to interrupt negative loops. For me, that meant clapping my hands twice, reciting a short mantra, then taking 3 deep breaths. The physical action created a hinge that allowed my mind to pivot rather than repeat. I practiced translating catastrophic thoughts into questions. What if I recover? What if this is a temporary storm? Questions opened possibilities. Catastrophes closed them. I cultivated a relationship with discomfort, not as a foe, but as a signal. Discomfort told me where to pay attention. It became a compass that was not always pleasant, but was often accurate. I found that small public commitments helped me too. Telling someone I would meet them for coffee the next week created a future obligation that anchored me to a life beyond immediate pain. Those commitments were humble but binding. I built a library of phrases that validated my reality without feeding shame. I am learning. I tried. I will try again tomorrow. These phrases were spare, not flabby. They named progress without pretending it was finished. I practiced being selective with my stories. I stopped telling the entire history to casual acquaintances. Instead, I offered a line that felt true and safe. That preserved my energy and kept my deeper repairs private until they were ready to be shared. I noticed how often relief arrived through contact. A hand on my shoulder. A hug that lasted exactly long enough. A friend's silence beside me. I did not discount these as minor. They were major midwifery for my recovery. I began to curate an interior soundtrack that soothed. Certain songs slowed me down. Certain poems reminded me I was not alone across time. I returned to lines from writers who had known the ache and had still made sentences that reached me like shelters. I practiced gratitude for the teachers in my relapse, the moments that forced me to learn patience, the conversations that made me honest, the nights that required endurance. I named them not because pain is desirable, but because it had refined my attention. I learned to be vigilant about meaning-making. I could take the relapse and either let it tell me I'm broken beyond repair, or let it teach me new modes of attention. I chose the latter more often than not, because it left me with actionable lessons. I began to see that repair is an anthology of small, contradicting practices, some tender and some fierce. There is no single method. Some days I needed a therapist's kilometers of expertise. Other days I needed nothing more than a black coffee and the decision to go outside. The combination created a mosaic rather than a single painting. I kept a running list of non-negotiables, things I would do even when I felt defeated. Sleep 8 hours when possible. Eat regular meals. Move for 10 minutes. These non-negotiables were modest but reliable markers of care. I noticed patterns across relapses and started drawing maps of triggers, responses, and outcomes. The more meticulous I became, the less surprising the relapses felt. Surprises used to annihilate me. Anticipation allowed me to prepare. I practiced reframing failure language. Instead of "I failed again," I said, "This attempt did not work. What did I learn?" The linguistic shift was small but tectonic over months. I learned to let solitude be restorative instead of punitive. There were nights when being alone meant tending to my inner life carefully, lighting a candle and reading something gentle, I learned to distinguish loneliness from constructive solitude. I became an archivist of small recoveries. I kept a jar, and every time I did something that felt like repair, a call made, a letter written, a breath held, I wrote it on a slip of paper and dropped it in the jar. On dark days, I'd open the jar and read the accumulated evidence that I had not been idle. I started to hold space for the unpredictable generosity of others. When someone offered help, I experimented with accepting rather than deflecting. Accepting did not make me passive, it made me humanly connected. I practiced re-entry rituals after intense emotional episodes. A ritual could be as simple as changing into comfortable clothes, lighting a candle, and making a warm drink. Rituals signaled to my nervous system that the storm had passed and a different mode of being was entering. I learned to separate the story of a relapse from the identity of being a relapse-prone person. The story was an event. Identity is a construct that can be altered. Tension between the two required ongoing negotiation. I began to collect small, steady testimonies from others, friends who had weathered similar storms, and kept them in a folder. Their notes, simple and unvarnished, became models of possibility. They showed me various ways to repair, and I borrowed liberally.
I cultivated a sense of astonishment at how many people carried hidden relapses beneath their polished surfaces. Knowing I was not unique in my falls decreased the shame and increased my compassion for others. I tuned into the slow work of rewiring habits. Old neural paths favored reactivity. New paths required repetition, deliberate attention, and time. I practiced and practiced until the new patterns felt less foreign. I allowed myself to be imperfect in front of people I loved. I practiced saying, "I am not okay right now," and watched how honest admission invited real care rather than performative fixes. I experimented with breathing patterns, longer exhales, counts, simple breaths, and learned how they changed my physiology and mood within minutes. Breathing became my first response rather than last resort. I reframed relapse as a sign of depth rather than defect. Depth meant I had been through things worth processing. It meant there was material to be transmuted rather than erased. I trained myself to notice the difference between productive dwelling and destructive rumination. Productive dwelling led to action. Rumination looped. Recognizing the difference allowed me to choose forward motion. I learned to ask for help without scripting an apology first. Help is not a favor, it is a tool. Using it didn't mean I was weak, it meant I was strategic. I kept practicing the art of returning to ordinary days. A normal day, groceries, a walk, a phone call, became a triumph after nights of collapse. Normalcy was a kind of medicine. I practiced radical honesty about my limits with important people. I asked for what I needed and accepted when they couldn't provide it. Acceptance freed me from dependency and encouraged me to diversify sources of support. I learned to frame my story not as a series of failures, but as a series of attempts. Each attempt taught me terms I could use for the next experiment in repair. I began to choose a life that was resilient not because it was unbreakable, but because it had better tools for repair. Better friends, better sleep, better rituals, better boundaries. I learned to scale back expectations elegantly. When relapse hit, I reduced the horizon of what I expected from myself. Scale back wasn't resignation, it was stewardship. I practiced the fierce tenderness of staying with pain for shorter increments. Feel, act, rest, return. The cycle repeated, but felt more manageable. I built a portfolio of antidotes: movement, art, conversation, nature, rest. Each antidote had conditions where it worked best. Learning which antidote to reach for was crucial. I started to appreciate the slow accrual of trust in myself. Trust is built by keeping small promises again and again. Those promises accumulated until the feeling of reliability could be leaned on. I learned to notice the small permissions I needed and give them to myself. Permission to cry, permission to leave, permission to rest, permission to continue. I practiced naming the subtle victories no one else would notice: a moment of calm in a storm, a breath taken before speaking, a text sent to ask for help. These invisible wins were not small, they were foundational. I kept building and rebuilding my life with the consciousness that it would not be perfectly fixed, only increasingly repairable, increasingly livable, increasingly generous. If this spoke to you, share this moment with someone who needs to know they are not alone. Like the video to help others find this conversation. Subscribe for more honest, raw conversations about repair and resilience. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next honest chapter. Leave a comment with the small thing that pulled you back and one tiny step you'll take today. Follow for more. Let's keep tending these lives together.